you give us an update on where your thinking is right now with Iran, if you have made a final decision on what you want to do?
I mean, I certainly can't tell you that, but we do have very big, powerful ships heading in that direction. I hope they negotiate something that's acceptable. If you could make a negotiated deal that would be satisfactory with no nuclear weapons, that they should do that. But I don't know that they will, but they are talking to us, seriously talking.
Trump is signaling talks with Iran while his own pressure campaign keeps tightening. According to public reporting, he said he planned to speak with Tehran even as Washington issued new Iran-related sanctions and expanded military deployments in the region. That is not a clean diplomatic pivot. It is a live stress test of law, markets, and alliance discipline, with every actor forced to react in real time. Oil has hovered near 6-month highs as investors track the tension. And according to public reporting, European foreign ministers have moved to brand Iran's Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. Talks, threats, and enforcement are colliding, and the collision is shrinking Trump's room to maneuver. Trump's posture toward Iran has returned to a familiar contradiction. He signals openness to talks, while his administration reinforces coercion. That posture is not just a message. It activates institutions that move on rules, not on mood. According to official documents from the U.S. Treasury, the Office of Foreign Assets Control announced additional action on the 30th of January 2026, targeting Iranian officials tied to violent repression and corruption, including Iran's Interior Minister Eskandar Momeni Kalagari. The same release also designated investor Babak Morteza Zanjani and described the first designation of IRGC-linked digital asset exchanges. Those designations matter because they expand compliance risk across banks, insurers, shipping, and payment rails. The first miscalculation is Trump's assumption that sanctions function as a simple bargaining chip he can raise for leverage and lower for headlines. Modern sanctions enforcement is a chain of legal designations, screening rules, correspondent banking controls, and private sector de-risking. Once firms move to protect themselves, the policy acquires inertia. A presidential signal about talking does not instantly restore risk appetite because penalties for getting it wrong remain. The second blind spot is that escalation produces internal U.S. constraints. Treasury has to justify designations within its authorities and document the record. State has to defend coherence to allies who must decide whether to align. The Pentagon has to plan for contingencies whenever threats are issued publicly. Those institutions do not pause simply because Trump wants a different headline. A third constraint is external. Markets and partners price Trump's posture as risk, not as strategy. When oil traders treat tension as a supply shock, that feeds inflation expectations and political pressure at home. When European capitals shift toward harder measures, Washington's room for private bargaining narrows because allied coordination turns into a public test of credibility. Trump therefore becomes reactive by design. The machinery expands when he pressures, and it keeps running when he hints at diplomacy. The longer this posture continues, the more the system hardens, and the less room Trump has to reverse course without a visible loss of leverage. Trump's talk signal arrived in the middle of an accelerating security posture. According to public reporting, Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi said Iran was prepared for the resumption of talks with the United States, but only if they were fair and equitable and did not include Iran's defensive and missile capabilities. He also said there were no meetings arranged with U.S. officials. That detail is the first reality check. Trump can announce intent, but diplomacy still requires a calendar, channels, and a minimum level of mutual confidence. In the same reporting, U.S. deployments were described as expanding, and Trump's plan to speak with Tehran was framed alongside an additional warship sent to the region. The Pentagon chief, according to public reporting, said the military would be ready to carry out whatever the president decided. According to public reporting, an American destroyer docked at the Israeli port of Eilat, a signal that regional partners were watching closely. This is not a backdrop, it is the core of the problem. Trump is trying to negotiate while generating battlefield readiness signals that make a counterpart assume coercion will escalate. Araghchi's own language sharpened the edge. According to public reporting, he said Tehran was ready for either negotiations or warfare. When a senior official frames the choice that starkly, it removes the comfortable middle space that Trump depends on for theatrical bargaining. Threats stop being leverage and start being countdowns. That is the miscalculation. Trump treats threat and dialogue as parallel tracks that can run without contaminating one another. In practice, they merge. A threat changes the incentives for every Iranian decision maker who fears being seen as yielding under pressure. A threat also changes the incentives for every U.S. institution that must prepare for the possibility that Trump's own language becomes a commitment. Institutional resistance appears in the form of procedure. Diplomats cannot offer relief that the Treasury has not authorized. Military planners cannot assume restraint when public threats are on the record. Allies cannot gamble on ambiguity when they have citizens, assets, and bases within range of retaliation. So the system responds by building buffers, more planning, more coordination, more caution, and less improvisation from the White House. Turkey's role in the reporting is revealing. According to public reporting, Ankara positioned itself as a potential facilitator, and Turkish officials said they were keeping lines open with Washington to avoid conflict. Regional countries, including the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, were also described as engaging diplomatically to prevent confrontation. This is how other states behave when they do not trust the stability of Trump's signaling. They try to insert a process between his words and the consequences. Meanwhile, Iran's declared boundary on defense capabilities highlights a trap Trump has built for himself. If he insists that missiles and broader defensive posture must be on the table, talks are likely to stall before they begin. If he drops that demand, he looks like he is retreating from his own pressure logic while the sanctions apparatus keeps biting. Oil markets are already acting as an amplifier of political cost, and every upward tick becomes domestic pressure that Trump cannot negotiate away. This is why Trump looks reactive, not in control. His talk signal is being received through the filter of ships, sanctions, and contingency plans. And because none of those filters can be switched off instantly, every day without a structured channel makes escalation pressures more self-sustaining. The critical escalation point is not Trump's promise to talk. It is the fact that, at the same time, he is weighing military action. According to public reporting, multiple sources said Trump was considering actions against Iran that included targeted strikes. That reporting sits beside other official signals. New sanctions issued, military deployments expanded, and allied governments hardening their posture. When those elements converge, they create an operational environment where a misread can trigger irreversible moves. This is the moment where Trump's decision-making style becomes a liability. He relies on ambiguity and spectacle. He threatens, then hints at talks, then tightens the screws again, believing uncertainty itself produces leverage. But institutions interpret uncertainty as risk, and risk triggers safeguards. In a crisis, safeguards function like a ratchet. They move toward readiness, and they do not unwind quickly. Start with the military channel. According to public reporting, the Pentagon has said it will be ready to carry out whatever the president decides. That is not a blank check for improvisation. It is a warning that planning is underway regardless of whether Trump has made up his mind. Planning creates timelines, strike packages, force protection, regional basing coordination, rules of engagement reviews, legal consultations, and messaging plans for allies. Once those gears turn, they generate their own pressure. Commanders do not ask for clarity with open microphones. They demand it in orders. Trump's public posture therefore narrows his private flexibility. Now add the economic channel. According to public reporting, oil hovered near 6-month highs as investors tracked U.S. Iran tensions, and the market was supported by persistent strain between Washington and Tehran. That is not merely a price chart, it is a constraint on policy. Higher energy prices feed inflation, and inflation hardens politics. The market is effectively voting on Trump's credibility. Every headline about strikes is treated as a supply disruption risk, and every escalation threat becomes a premium. Trump does not control that pricing mechanism, and he cannot order it to relax. Then comes the alliance channel, where Trump's leverage is supposed to expand through collective pressure. According to public reporting, European Union foreign ministers agreed to include the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps on the bloc's list of terrorist organizations and adopted new Iran sanctions. The shift was described as symbolic, but its practical meaning is sharper. European institutions are moving their own legal machinery into a harder posture. Once that happens, the United States cannot quietly trade away pressure to unlock talks without triggering allied scrutiny. If Washington softens while Europe hardens, the transatlantic front fractures. If Washington hardens to match Europe, diplomacy becomes harder. Here is Trump's blind spot. He assumes allies will fall in line behind his tempo. In reality, allies seek to insulate themselves from his volatility. Europe's move is not only about Iran, it is also about reducing dependence on Trump's day-to-day signaling by anchoring policy in the EU process. That is institutional resistance at the international level, and it restricts Trump's options because it reduces his ability to bargain privately. Next, the legal financial channel. According to official documents from the U.S. Treasury, OFAC, the 30th of January 2026, action targeted officials tied to violent repression and corruption, including Iran's interior minister and designated Babak Morteza Zanjani. The release also described the first designation of IRGC-linked digital asset exchanges, framing it as action within the financial sector of the Iranian economy. This is not theatrical. It tells banks and platforms that enforcement is widening into digital pathways. Even if Trump claims he wants talks, this is the government saying that the pressure campaign is expanding into new nodes. That expansion has consequences that necessarily follow. Compliance departments respond by tightening screening. Counterparties respond by stepping back. Trade finance becomes more cautious. Insurance becomes more expensive. Any intermediary that touches a sanctioned network becomes a potential target for enforcement. In other words, the sanctions system does what it was designed to do. It raises the economic cost of normal transactions. And because it operates through private actors, it keeps working even when politics shifts. Now return to the diplomatic channel, because this is where Trump is publicly selling the idea of control. According to public reporting, Arakchi said Iran was prepared for fair and equitable negotiations, but would not discuss defense and missile capabilities, and that there were no meetings arranged. That combination is decisive. It means there is no structured off-ramp as Trump raises the temperature. Trump's adversarial framing shows up here. He wants the world to believe that Iran will bend because he threatens harder than anyone else. But that view ignores how negotiations actually fail. They fail when both sides define red lines in public, when domestic politics punishes compromise, and when military postures compress time. Trump is doing all three at once. He is issuing threats that make de-escalation look like weakness. He is backing those threats with visible deployments. And he is allowing the sanctions machine to expand in ways that reduce Iran's incentive to trust any promise of relief. This is why the simplistic narrative of war versus peace is misleading. The real dynamic is constraint versus improvisation. Trump is trying to improvise while every institution around him is building constraints. Markets tighten the constraint by pricing escalation. Allies tighten it by codifying a harder stance. Treasury tightens it by adding designations that widen compliance risk. The Pentagon tightens it by planning for a decision Trump has not made. In that environment, Trump's remaining options shrink to uncomfortable choices. He can try to force talks under threat, but public reporting shows Iran rejecting negotiation under the shadow of threats and drawing a line around missiles. He can escalate militarily, but that risks retaliation against U.S. forces and partners, and deepens the energy market shock that is already forming. He can pause, but the machinery he set in motion will continue to grind, and a pause without a negotiated framework looks like hesitation rather than strategy. The destabilizing consequence is that even a decision not to strike can produce escalation, because prolonged ambiguity sustains market tension, sustains military readiness, and sustains alliance hardening. Trump is not steering events as much as he is reacting to the feedback loop he created. At this stage, each day of threats without a structured channel raises the chance that a single incident will force Trump into an option he does not control. The response to Trump's posture is already visible in how institutions behave. Europe's decision to designate the IRGC and approve new sanctions is a reminder that allied systems do not simply wait for Washington to decide what it wants. They formalize their own positions, and formal positions become constraints on future bargaining. According to public reporting, EU foreign ministers agreed to include the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps on the bloc's list of terrorist organizations, placing it in a category comparable to groups such as Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. According to public reporting, Some member states had been cautious, warning the step could hinder communication and endanger European citizens in Iran, but momentum shifted after Iran's crackdown. In other words, Europe accepted higher risk in exchange for a harder line. For Trump, that is a strategic problem. His preferred method is to keep multiple outcomes on the table and claim credit for whichever one arrives. But when allies lock in a harsher posture, the range of acceptable compromise narrows. If Trump pivots toward talks, European measures still signal that the Western posture is hardening, not softening. If Trump pivots toward force, the alliance hardens further, and the risk of retaliation spreads across more capitals. The market response tightens the vice. According to public reporting, oil hovered near 6-month highs as investors tracked U.S.-Iran tensions. That is a mechanical penalty for uncertainty. Energy traders do not need a confirmed strike to price disruption risk. They price the possibility that a strike is being considered and that retaliation could threaten supply or shipping lanes. That pricing pressure is destabilizing because it feeds domestic political costs, and those costs reduce Trump's freedom to sustain a prolonged standoff. Trump's miscalculation is visible here. He treats the threat of force as a cheap signal. In reality, the signal is expensive. It forces military readiness, raises market risk premiums, and pushes allies to formalize harsher measures in case Trump's impulse becomes action. Even the act of considering strikes, according to public reporting, is enough to trigger those costs. Institutional resistance is not dramatic. It is procedural. Treasury's sanctions, according to official documents, are framed as actions tied to repression and corruption and as designations reaching into digital asset exchanges. That framing gives the compliance world a clear message. Enforcement is widening and the record is being built. Once a record is built, reversing course requires justification, and justification is political capital. On the diplomatic side, according to public reporting, Iran says talks can be fair and equitable, but cannot include defense capabilities, and that no meetings are arranged. Turkey has been described in public reporting as offering a facilitator role, another sign that regional actors are trying to build guardrails around Trump's volatility. Without a structured channel, Trump's talk signal remains a gesture, not a path. Trump's remaining choices are narrowing into 3 unattractive lanes: accept talks that exclude issues he has highlighted, escalate to force with market and alliance fallout, or linger in ambiguity while the costs compound. Each lane reduces his leverage, because each lane forces him to pay a price without a guaranteed strategic return. As the machinery keeps moving and the diplomatic channel remains unbuilt, the pressure on Trump tightens toward a decision point that will not wait for his preferred timing. Trump's signal that he wants to speak with Iran is being swallowed by the machinery he has accelerated. According to public reporting, Iran says it can return to talks only on terms that exclude its defensive capabilities, and there are no meetings arranged. According to public reporting, Trump is weighing options that include targeted strikes, while U.S. deployments expand. The miscalculation is structural. Trump tries to use volatility as leverage, but volatility is what institutions and markets move to contain. Treasury's sanctions, according to official documents, widen the compliance perimeter. Europe's move to list the IRGC as a terrorist organization locks in a harsher allied baseline. Oil markets treat the tension as a premium, turning geopolitical theater into domestic economic pressure. Trump's remaining options are narrow and costly. A clean diplomatic off-ramp requires a process, and according to public reporting, the process is not built. Escalation risks retaliation and a wider market shock. Prolonged ambiguity sustains the pressure loop and strips Trump of timing control. For more fact-locked analysis, subscribe and use the source pack below.